Film study is more than just a fancy term for watching fights. When done right, it's one of the best tools you can use to pick up new techniques, develop training drills, and increase your boxing IQ. Increase it even beyond the collective knowledge that's contained in your gym. As an exercise, studying film is useful for anyone with an interest in boxing, and it's essential for those without regular access to a trainer. And if you're strictly a fan, I still recommend it, since the more you know, the more joy you'll get out of boxing. And when you can spot and appreciate the small things as much as this guy, fights become endlessly rewatchable. Whatever your motivations, you have nothing to lose by studying film. It's completely free, and all you need is YouTube, so you're halfway there. And really, it's my hope that once you've learned a bit more about how to parse different techniques and break down exchanges, and you've made note of all the time-saving hotkeys I share here, your next move, right after this video, will be to jump into a free fight and start studying. In this video, we will discuss 3 types of film study, each with their own training utility. Number 1, studying the opponent. Active boxers often study footage of future opponents, hoping to spot tendencies that could be exploited on fight night. For example, if you notice your opponent gets lazy bringing their jab back, you might focus on slipping and countering with the right hand. Finding recent footage of the opponent is not necessarily going to be that easy, especially for amateur fighters, but it's almost always worth a look. Think of it as a head start on the feeling out process of a fight where you gauge the opponent's movements, reactions, and preferred punches in order to plan your attack. That said, some boxers prefer not to watch their opponents, and that's a perfectly valid approach too. After all, there's always a risk of developing too much respect for your opponent's game, getting too comfortable with the role of passive observer, getting used to watching the opponent work when you should be focusing on imposing your will. Even more concerning, your opponent may have corrected the weaknesses you spotted before you get a chance to fight. When this happens, there's a good chance you'll have wasted some training time in your camp preparing for a habit or a scenario that never comes. Number 2 is studying the best. This form of film study involves the analysis of pro fight and training videos for the purposes of learning new skills, developing training drills, and increasing your boxing IQ. For example, suppose you wanted to improve your cross. First, you'll want to identify fighters who are known for their cross, and specifically the cross characteristics you're trying to improve. If you wanted more power, you might study the punch mechanics of Thomas Hearns or Kelly Pavlik. To develop a faster lead cross, you might analyze Floyd Mayweather's setups and shoulder positioning. Once you've picked a fighter to focus on and begun to home in on some of their different punch mechanics, entries, and exits, work these technical details into drills and develop them through boxing's natural training progression, starting with very isolated, very controlled drills with no other techniques being used, into more free-form drilling, into free-form shadow boxing, then the heavy bag, then focus mitts, sparring, and finally fighting. Unlike studying the opponent, this form of boxing film study is recommended for competitive and recreational boxers of any level, and there are really no downsides. This style of film study is going to be our focus today, but the study exercises and tips and hotkeys that I'm going to share here today will apply to all 3 styles. Like shadow boxing in the mirror, watching yourself on video shows you what your opponent sees, giving you a chance to spot any openings before they do. And for non-competitors, it's still one of the best ways to identify technical errors and see what needs to improve. This style of boxing film study is very intuitive. You spot your mistakes, those that you're aware of, and then you focus on correcting them, if at all possible. And for most viewers with a smartphone, it will be very easy. Try to record yourself regularly and share that footage with your coach. After all, if they're any good, they'll be able to spot a lot more than you will. Everybody has different study habits, and I don't want to suggest that my method is any better than yours, but the following 6 study practices definitely helped make me a better student of the game, so maybe they'll help you too. Number 1, turn off the commentary. When you sit down to study film, the first thing you should do is hit the mute button. Boxing commentary isn't especially educational. It focuses on the spectacle, not the sport.
With the possible exception of some officials in Baghdad, we've involved more disinformation than anybody tonight, haven't we? That's right.
Though exceptions do exist, like Teddy Atlas and Paulie Malignaggi and Andre Ward, you're usually better off cutting out the distraction altogether. That said, if you're studying training footage, leaving the sound on can come in quite handy. You can learn a lot about your punches by the sound they make hitting the mitts, and if you're watching pro training, you might even overhear some helpful coaching cues passed from trainer to fighter.
One other thing. When you're in close like this, so you see we had you like this. You know what you're supposed to do with your right hand? Bring it underneath. Swing it like this here. That's right.
Number 2, pause, slow down, and replay often. Film study isn't like watching the fights with your friends. Things happen so fast in boxing, you can easily miss important technical details if you let a fight play from start to finish. Familiarize yourself with the following keyboard shortcuts and be prepared to pause, slow down, and replay the same exchange over and over again. Number 3, isolate exchanges. Every fight or sparring session is really just a series of exchanges, broken up by entries, such as jabbing into range, and exits, like pivoting out after a combination. I recommend studying individual exchanges rather than trying to wrap your head around an entire round's worth of action at once. Most exchanges don't last long, maybe 5 to 8 seconds, but I think you may be surprised by just how many technical details a fighter can pack into 5 or 8 seconds worth of action. Number 4, watch lots of different fighters and even different sports. Don't limit your film study to one fighter whose style you want to emulate. This is a common beginner mistake. Instead, study as many different fighters as you can. Try to get a look at everything that's out there and expand your vision of what's possible in the ring. You may be surprised by just how much you're able to borrow from other fighters, even when their styles aren't supposed to mesh with yours. And you may be even more surprised by what you can borrow from other sports.
Position is everything in wrestling. Even if I don't have a ton of offense, if I have great positioning, no matter what he has, it's tough for this guy to score me. I keep a nice stance. Underestimated most times is using your head for defense. And defense is head, hands, hips, right? So I'm kind of leading with my head here.
As your film study habits improve, you'll learn to take lessons from just about anything. Certain athletic principles just carry over, even from non-combative sports. And though boxing is always the best learning material, studying Muay Thai or wrestling or even basketball can help develop your understanding of leverage, balance, timing, posture, and much, much more. Number 5, don't forget to study training footage. After all, if you want to fight like the pros, you need to know how they train. There is a shocking amount of raw training footage online, and careful study uncovers a lot of gems, especially when trainers or fighters start talking shop. Number 6, pay attention to what both fighters are doing at all times. You may focus on one fighter at a time, but it's important to always be aware of the broader context in which their techniques are being used. To do this, you have to watch both fighters, even if you're focusing on one over the other. The pros and cons exercise will move you one step closer to understanding the secret of boxing, which is that there is no secret, there are no rules, and anything can work in the right context. Before I get into the exercise itself, allow me to briefly expand on this point. In boxing, there are best practices. Some techniques land at a much higher percentage and generally keep you safer than others, and these have become the core fundamentals of the sweet science. And while mastering these core fundamentals is key, limiting yourself to the textbook stunts your growth and makes you predictable. Knowing when to bend and break the rules is the sign of a true master in anything. And you only reach that level once you expand your vision of what's possible in the ring. Rather than labeling any technique as inherently good or bad, try to identify the pros and cons. Works. First, choose a single technique to study from a fight exchange you've isolated. Once you've done that, start by listing the pros of this technique. Remember to factor in what the other fighter is doing too. It can be hard to get past stylistic biases. Some people can't imagine ever dropping the hands or throwing a rear hook or crossing the feet before a pivot. But challenge yourself to remain objective and list all of the positives that you possibly can. For example, we might say Roy Jones Jr. keeping his hands down is very easy on the shoulders. The low hand position shortens the distance his body punches have to travel, and it also works like a tightrope walker's pole, improving balance to make footwork and head movement easier. As you can see, writing off unorthodox techniques means missing out on a lot of strategic options and technical information. Next, we list the cons. List every possible downside you can think of. This will help you calculate risks in the ring so you can make better decisions under stress. For example, Roy Jones Jr. dropping his hands leaves him wide open to be hit. It's also terrible for hand fighting and puts him a step behind if the opponent chooses to initiate a clinch. And more broadly, it just robs him of all of the long guard and hand control options that we so like to discuss on this channel. Remember, there are pros and cons to every move you make in the ring, and this film study exercise will help you understand them so that you can make the best decisions for your unique body type, disposition, and opponent.